Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to KEI. I'm Kyle Ferrier, the Director of Academic Affairs and Research here. Thank you all for coming. Today's program is part of our academic paper series. It's actually a turning point in our academic paper series for the year because the papers and programs preceding this one have focused more on North Korea, while today's program and the programs moving forward are going to have more of a focus on South Korea. And the topic of today's program is an important one, especially here in Washington, as we think about the trilateral relationship with South Korea and Japan, and the path forward to improving that relationship is improving the Japanese-South Korea bilateral relationship, which we know has been under strained ties in the past few months, especially since the South Korean Constitutional Court ruling on forced laborers and reparations owed to them during World War II. And the latest news this morning about the strained ties is that Moon and Abe won't actually meet at the G20 coming up in Osaka. So there's just less of an opportunity for them to work through these issues at the government-to-government level, and there's actually, leading into your presentation, there may be room for businesses to get involved in both South Korea and Japan in improving interstate relations between the two countries. So we're really looking forward to your presentation. And before we get started on that, let me just introduce our two speakers. Dr. Kristin Vekasi is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and School of Policy and International Affairs at the University of Maine. She specializes in political economy, dynamics of political conflict, foreign direct investment, and nationalism, also with a strong focus on Northeast Asia. She has a book coming out in a couple weeks, Risk Management Strategies of Japanese Companies in China, Political Crisis, and Multinational Firms. And joining her in the presentation, her co-author, who I'm very proud to announce, is Jiwon Nam. She's a graduate of the School of the same school, the School of Policy and International Affairs from the University of Maine. She also got her MBA at the University of Maine, and she's starting her PhD in political science at Delaware in the fall, where she's looking a little bit at the Korea's relationship with Central Asia moving forward. But most importantly, she is a former KEI intern. So it just goes to show everyone here or watching the great things you can do as a KEI intern. So thank you for coming back, and I'll turn things over to Kristin to get us started.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming today. A few years ago, Jiwon and I started to work on a project, and it was in the midst of when I was still working on this book project, which is coming out in, on July 8th, that looks at how political tensions, political friction between Japan and China affect Japanese firms there. And I really wanted to do this comparative project. Well, how does it work in Korea? Right? Are there different dynamics? Are there the same dynamics? So Jiwon and I started to dig into this, and much to our shock and to my chagrin, because it couldn't go into my book, we didn't find that much in Korea. We couldn't do. So instead we wrote a paper, which is a different paper. It's coming out at the Journal of Asian Security and International Affairs in a few months, that tries to explain why does this happen in China when it doesn't happen in Korea. And we thought that when we did that research that there was really a lot of implications from that finding for Japan-Korea relations. In particular, that the risks are fewer than are generally perceived, and that there was more of a risk-free space in Korea-Japan relations for the private sector to maybe take a more assertive role there. So as I'm sure you all know, right, so Japan-Korea relations for a long time have been very frustrating. There seems to be a lot of space there for mutual benefit. I know.
Borrow this one.
Great, thank you. Mutual benefit, mutual exchange, there's mutual economic dependence. It used to be much more heavily focused that Korea was more dependent on Japan than vice versa. That's actually evened out in the last decade or so to some extent. Of course, the shared alliance structure, there are shared interests with the United States, there are shared interests in Southeast Asia. Perhaps there's a shared experience of having American troops based, and the challenges that come with that. There's perhaps shared interest in moving away from economic dependence on China, something that could be done mutually, right? So there's all of these things, and yet what we generally see is, what we generally see is that those perceived shared interests don't move into a more easy relationship. So in the talk today, we have two main takeaways, and the first is, and we'll present a bunch of evidence, and you can let us know if you're convinced during the Q&A, that the risks for the private sector are lower than one might imagine. In an Asan Institute report from a few years back, the authors wrote that Korean actors seem to think that the risk of public backlash from engaging with Japan in a proactive way is thought to be embedded in Korean society with no clear upsides. So what we want to demonstrate is that this isn't the case, that there are upsides and the downsides are actually lower than are perceived. Our second takeaway is that we did dig and we found some private advocacy that exists, and we'll talk about ways that we think that can be expanded upon. So as I'm sure you all know, and as Kyle alluded to, the last 10 months have been really rough for Japan and South Korea. In particular, thinking about the private sector, last October, the Korean Supreme Court ruled that the company Nippon Steel and Sumitomo Metal Corporation were liable for compensating Korean forced laborers from the occupation, and particularly the wartime. And Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. For the same reason. Now the companies have resisted this ruling, and I'll go into that a little bit more, and have had some of their assets seized. It's a very, very concerning development for the Japanese business community in Korea. The reconciliation group that was set up from Abe and Park's agreement about the so-called comfort woman was disbanded. After that, there was this issue with the radar that the Korean destroyer targeting a Japanese aircraft patrol with its radar. Everyone's denying everything, right? None of these things really are moving forward, right? Neither side's willing to admit any errors. And in particular, thinking about this court decision, the Japanese private sector is concerned that there'd be spillover into the economic sphere more generally. And I'm going to put this statement up here in its entirety. I'm not going to read it to you, I promise, because it's somewhat rare. So this is a statement from 4 major Japanese business groups, which I'll talk about in more depth a little bit later. That specifically addresses this decision. And there are a few points that they make. They emphasize how important Japan-Korea relations are, how they need to work to promote trade and investment relations. Just one statement from this, they say, "We strongly urge the Korean government to take appropriate measures to protect legitimate economic activities of Japanese companies so the ruling will not damage the relationship between the two countries." They emphasize the need to stick to the 1965 normalization agreement that had sort of loans and aid, and say, all right, we'll move past compensation issues, we'll just take it there. So there's concern within these groups like Keidanren, Keizai Doyukai, et cetera, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, that there is going to be broader spillover into the economic interests that they have. And indeed, that ruling and other things that Jiwon's going to talk about in just a minute or two really do seem to emphasize that there might be risks. So what are sort of these perceived risks? What's the community so worried about? Yeah.
So these concerning views are not only coming from the business people, but also from the ordinary citizens. So when we look at this graph, the data is collected from 2013 to 2019 about Korean people's impressions about Japan and Japanese people's impression about Korea. So in this line is the 0, like no impression, and then the lighter blue area is the positive impression of each other, and then darker blue area is the negative impressions of each other. So when we look at this Korea graph, we can see the positive impression is gradually increasing over time, but we can still see there's so many people still hate Japan, and it's the same case from Japanese people towards Korea. So all this general bad impression about each other make Korean companies worry about having more positive relationship with Japanese companies and more robust trade with Korea and Japan. So in Korea, we have the Institute for Research and Collaborationist Activities, 민족문제연구소 in Korean. They published a list of Japanese individual collaborators as well as the companies that were founded based upon Japanese assets after occupation ended. And in the picture over here is a few companies out of almost 300 officially identified companies that were founded by Japanese assets or Japanese collaborators. This year in 2019, for the independence movement, they addressed President Moon Jae-in, said, quote, wiping out the vestiges of pro-Japanese collaborators is a long overdue undertaking. Only when we contemplate past wrongdoings can we move forward towards the future together. What we intend is neither to investigate divisiveness by reopening old wounds now, nor to create issues for diplomatic conflicts with the neighboring country. Neither of these is desirable. Wiping out the vestiges of pro-Japanese collaborators, just as with diplomacy, should be done in a forward-looking manner. So from the President Moon and other ordinary Korean people are really looking forward to wiping out these Japanese collaborators, which makes companies more afraid of having friendly policies towards Japanese companies. So in this picture, we have this very iconic Japanese companies, list of companies that Korean people want to boycott. One of the store, just regular store in a town, we found a quote saying that my store's major profits comes from selling cigarettes, but I won't sell Japanese brands like Mild 7 even if it decreases sales revenue. So ordinary store owners, Korean store owners want to not sell Japanese product even though that decrease their revenues. And furthermore, we got a quote from Gongju City Council meeting of one of the members of council saying Japan keeps calling Dokdo Takeshima and arguing that it is their territory. This behavior is unforgivable and arrogant. Japanese brands such as Sony, Toyota, ASICS are prevalent in South Korea, and we need to start boycotting them to let Japanese know that Korean people are angry and Japan's ridiculous arguments. So we like this, even political people or ordinary people really hate Japanese, and they tried really hard to boycott Japanese products. And maybe it's the same for Japanese people, because we found, according to the survey done by the Korea Foundation for International Cultural Exchange, many Japanese people lower their favorability of Korean products, and almost 25% of Japanese people don't like Korean movies because of political diplomatic situation that we are having right now.
So there seems to be Oh, it's all good. It's good. Yeah, it's fine. So there seems to be, right, when we think about this, there threatened boycotts, threatened retaliation because of political tensions, and both Korea and Japan and the private sectors from both of those countries do have experiences in Northeast Asia with their neighbors having exactly this experience of economic retaliation. In particular, they have this with China. So a lot of the data we'll show today is in the paper, but here's some bonus data. That's not. So we'll look at two instances of looking at what does it mean when you actually do see economic retaliation following political conflicts. This graph right here shows Japanese automobile exports to China before and after the Japanese nationalization of the Senkaku Islands, or the Diaoyudao in Chinese. And you can see that after the September nationalization, the exports just plummet. They do slowly recover, but it takes a couple of years. One of the points of recovery was when Abe Shinzo of Japan met Xi Jinping of China at it was APEC, and they had their awkward handshake there. And so it's really disappointing that they're not going to be meeting at G20, right? Because that could be this moment for Japan and South Korea, another awkward handshake. But that did help with the recovery. So anyway, we see this happen. We also see this happen, and I'll just show two examples. There are many that I could pull up of Chinese tourists visiting Japan. So again, you see a pretty stark separation, divide there. It does again slowly recover. It takes a couple of years, and now Chinese tourism has really taken off in Japan since then. But we did. You see a fairly large economic consequence there, losing tourism. We also see similar patterns in Korea. Oops. So this is looking at the THAAD issue, right, rather than territorial issues. So this is also looking at Korean automobile exports to China before and after the THAAD issues became prominent. And you can see this is in many ways very stark. I suspect, I don't have deep expertise in the Korean automobile industry within China. I suspect it fell off, and then they shifted production to China. And now so you don't see trade recovering because production has shifted to China, and so it's not showing up in trade data. But again, that's not my particular area of expertise. So don't take that one to the bank, right? But we see this big consequence. We also see this very starkly with tourism. So right after the THAAD issue started, Chinese tourism to Korea was really starting to blossom. And in fact, so this is showing monthly data. We saw almost 1 million Chinese tourists visiting Korea per month. And then after the THAAD issues really started to escalate, China officially cut off, it told the Chinese tourist companies to stop selling tour packages to visit Korea, and you can see it just really plummets right where that red arrow is, and it slowly recovered, but it's nowhere near back to where the peaks were in the spring of 2017. So this has been a really big blow to the Chinese tourism industry, right? It's an important part of the economy, and it's something that shows that we do see, right? So the private sectors in Korea and Japan have experienced this. In our research, we looked back through the 1990s through the present day. We could talk about that more, but this is a pattern we've fairly consistently seen. So risk perception is pretty high amongst the private sector working within this region.
Is it really true in Korea-Japan relations? So we can look at this BTS example because this was very controversial at one point. BTS is a Korean singer group that's really popular in Korea and East Asia, and they have certain concerts worldwide. And one of the members was wearing this T-shirt saying patriotism over our history, liberation, Korea, and it has these pictures of Japanese Hiroshima and Nagasaki nuclear bombing, the attack in World War II. So in Japan, it was very controversial because it's talking about Korea-Japan history, which is unresolved. So Japanese TV shows was canceled about BTS, and it was a big issue. And it seemed like a big issue because of it seemed the political issue affected the cultural exchange between Korea and Japan. However, 2 weeks after this incident happened, BTS song was ranked number 1 in Japanese pop song chart, and their concert ticket continued to be sold out. And in the next slide, we're going to show the tweet media trade between Korea and Japan, because we also looked at clothing, makeup, tobacco, automobiles, electronics, and machinery and other sectors trade, and we see the most diversity in this media trade, but all these, including media, all these other sectors don't seem to be affected by the political issue. So in this graph, we analyze the media exports between Korea and Japan from 2019 to current days, and we before and after the 2018 political crisis. And the export from Japan to Korea seemed to decrease a little bit after like October 2018, but it quickly recovers and it continues to increase in 2019. And Korean sales to Japan doesn't seem to be affected by the 2018 series of political crises. And next is the tourism between Korea and Japan, also from 2018 to 19. From Japanese tourists to Korea doesn't seem to be affected by the 2018 crisis, and even Korean tourists increased after, slightly decreased right after the October 2018, but it also increased after 2019. So the trade, it's not that trade is not sometimes affected by the crisis, but it is different. It's affected by different factors other than political issues. Next, we show the actual drop and break of trade between Korea and Japan. This example is from before and after. We are comparing before and after the Fukushima nuclear disaster, which happened in Japan in March 2011. So on the left side, we see the Japanese fish sales to Korea. So before March 2011, there's some trade going on, and after March 2011, it suddenly decreased, and it continued to have a decreased amount of trade because Korea feared about nuclear radiation and stopped importing the Japanese fishes. And Korean fish sales to Japan didn't seem to be affected. So if political issues, so in this case, we see there's a trade is affected by the disaster, nuclear disaster, and not by the political issues. So if political issues affect Korea and Japan trade and cultural exchange, we should see this kind of graph in all the other sectors, but before and after political incidents, like we see in this fish trade. But we don't see this in BTS Example, Japan-Korea tourism, media exchange before and after 2018 political crisis. So we have hope that private sectors of Korea and Japan can move forward to having a better Korea-Japan relationship. And Dr. Vekasi will elaborate in that point more in detail.
Interesting when we were doing some of this research is we analyzed a whole bunch of different sectors, as Jiwon said, looking at when the Japan's new security bill was passed, and that was another real low point in Japan-Korea relations. And we did like these fancy statistical tests to see if we could find structural discontinuities in a variety of trade sectors, et cetera. And we did find it in one sector, which was eye makeup. So that was the eye machine. Shiseido, he wasn't able to sell for a few months successfully in Korea, but everything else we weren't able to find structural breaks, and we thought we might have found one with media. It's hard to do at this point. We need a few more months of data going out to get a good before and after to see what a trend is, but. Perhaps before the December publication. So when we talk about this, so we think, so looking at historically and also just this most recent crisis, we're digging and digging, right? Are these perceived risks actually observed risks? And in general, we think the answer is no. There's some talk, but we don't actually see a actualization of these into real risks. And we think that there's a role then for an advocacy role for the business community. And why and what sorts of potential tactics do we think might work? So there may be a role for individuals in the private sector and perhaps for individual businesses, but largely what we're talking about are peak organizations or in business groups. And so on the Japanese side, so there's a group Keidanren, which is an organization of large businesses. The Federation of Korean Industries is a similar sort of group in Korea. In Japan, there's also a group that's been active to some extent with Japan-Korea issues and promoting trade and investment called Keizai Doryukai, which is a group made up of Japanese executives. They join as individuals. And then, of course, both countries have a Chamber of Commerce and Industry that has, to some extent, a presence in the other country. Now, the Korean Chamber actually has an office in Japan, right? But the Japanese Chamber of Commerce and Industry does not have an office in Seoul, or in Korea at this point. There's also a matched pair of groups, the Japan-Korea or Korea-Japan economic cooperation groups that have typically annual summits to try and promote trade and investment ties. Now, this year's meeting has been postponed, perhaps canceled by the Japanese side, which is, again, discouraging. Often these things can go forward even if the heads of state don't meet. But so far this year, that's been fairly discouraging. So what can or what again do they actually do? So there are 4 potential tactics that we have identified, and the first is using public statements, right? So using active political lobbying and voice. So from these organizations and perhaps from individuals. So the goal here, and I gave one example earlier that was perhaps not so encouraging, since it was more, let's just shelve this and move on, right? Which isn't going to lead very far. But the goal here is to try and de-escalate, right? To be a voice to move focus away from maybe some of the more difficult issues that, such as territorial disputes, and towards more win-win issues. This is an area particularly where we think that Japan-Korea relations is lacking. That active voice that will publicly stand up and say, we would like to cooperate, and we know these things are hard, but we would like to keep going. And we think that the private sector could do that. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit more later. There's also, of course, businesses sort of bread and butter of cross-border engagement, right? So economic engagement through trade, through investment, also through jobs. So one of the things we found that has been moving forward in Korea-Japan economic relations, even as these summits and more maybe overt forms of cooperation have been canceled or postponed, is that groups are working to try and bring young Koreans into large Japanese companies. So for example, this spring there was a group that was actively recruiting and placing young Koreans into Mitsubishi, which is also having its assets seized in Korea. Right, so these things exist simultaneously. So our goals here, of course, are deepening interdependence, providing opportunities in elite Japanese companies for young Koreans that are well-educated, very frustrated that they're not able to find meaningful work within the Korean economy. So that could be a path forward. And of course, this can also help companies do what they really want to do, make more money. There's also possibilities for third country cooperation. In particular, we found consistent evidence of some of these groups, particularly the Korea-Japan economic cooperation groups, working to promote interests in Southeast Asia together. So joint efforts done by Peak Organization. In the most recent efforts they did were in Vietnam, but they so this helps the companies improve capacity in third countries to improve money-making opportunities, and it also potentially helps them jointly diversify from China. And this is something in other research I found quite a bit of evidence that, particularly in more politically sensitive sectors, when there are political tensions with China, that those sectors tend to more actively start to diversify to Southeast Asia, all other factors held equal. And lastly, we see public diplomacy style activities. I say style activities because public diplomacy is usually done by the public sector, but here we have the private sector engaging in public diplomacy. So these are things, I'll give you a few more details, but improving person-to-person exchanges, trying with the long-term goal of trying to improve sentiment and feelings between improve feelings between the countries. There's pretty acknowledged benefits for the two countries to cooperate. So I didn't show the Abe Xi Jinping picture, but here's another awkward photo from last year of three heads of state: China, Japan, Korea, from left to right, and at this conference, this business summit, they released a joint statement. Business leaders released a joint statement, and they specifically said, right, so Japan, China, and Korea as key neighbors have built close reciprocal relations over many years of exchange in a wide range of spheres, including politics, diplomacy, business, and culture. In business especially, the three nations have become essential partners for one another through strong trade and investment ties and collaboration in fourth country markets. Stable political and diplomatic relations are crucial as a sustainable platform for amicable trilateral cooperation in order to further develop strong collaborative relationships in business and industry and exercise the leadership developed in the world. So these business leaders specifically said, all right, specifically emphasized the need to have stable diplomacy, the ability to sit down in the same room to hold these summits, to negotiate in order to promote their interests. If we think about various or concrete measures that would promote economic interests, we have things like the long rumored, has not yet come to be, China, Japan, Korea free trade agreement. So there's, from at least 2002, there has been a desire to have this. There have been serious feasibility studies done starting a decade ago, and we're not really any closer to seeing that. And in one of the reasons, there are many economic conflicts, and I'm happy to get into that in the Q&A if people would like to. But one of the reasons is that every few years we have these political tensions, and even at the working level, people can't get together in the same room to hammer out that really nitty-gritty of how do we get the Japanese agricultural sector to agree to something? How do we get the Korean electronics sector to agree to something where every country is going to have to make concessions to get to an FTA? And so they haven't been able to go through that process as much as they can, because often these separate politics, the non-economic interest politics, get in the way. So if there was improvement for the business community, there are some very tangible benefits that could be present for the business community. So some of the things they're doing right now is, one thing is these public diplomacy activities that I alluded to. So this is a picture from about 4 years ago, 2015. This is the 24th annual high school student exchange. This is run by the Japan-Korea Economic Cooperation Group. So it's funded by businesses. And every year, again, they haven't done it this year. It's usually held in the summer, so maybe it will still happen. But I haven't found any press releases about it in my searching. They bring young people from Korea to Japan, or young Japanese to Korea. This one's in Korea. In order to, they have this forum where they talk about political, economic, business, sustainability issues, that sort of thing, to bring young people closer together. These activities have also happened between Japan and China. It's something I've done extensive research on, and I have two major findings, but one is that companies that were had higher risk exposure in the Chinese context gave more money to these activities. But I also found that when successive waves of political tensions arose, companies that engaged more in these public diplomacy activities were less likely to be targeted in the future. These are potential things that can help de-escalate personal feelings, not towards just a country, but also perhaps towards individual firm itself. So over the long run, we have seen these sorts of things happen between Japan and Korea, and we think there might be a space for more of those. A second thing that happens is just plain sort of cultural exchange promotion. So there's a group, it's me, Japan-Korea Cultural Exchange Foundation, that promotes art, and they do a lot of music and artistic, not symposiums, performances. And this group has prominent leadership and funding from business communities from both sides, but particularly from the Japanese side. So for example, the leadership on the Japanese side rotates through the large business organization. So it'll be Keidanren, Keizai Doyukai, the chamber, and then like a cement company that has a lot of business interests in Korea, then back to Keidanren, et cetera. So over the last, it started in the early 1980s, we've seen consistent leadership from the Japanese business community. From the Korean side, participation has been a lot more from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, bureaucrats, some artists, other bureaucrats, as well as academics. But there is prominent leadership from one particular Japanese business person, who's the former chairman of LG and now the honorary president of LG, Koo Cha-kyung. And he has been, so from 1986 still down to the present, holding a leadership position. And he's the honorary chairman now, right? He was chairman, now he's the honorary chairman, yeah. In this. So we see the business communities from both sides, right, pouring some effort into this. So excuse me. So when we think, so we have a couple of conclusions, three large points from here, is that largely, right, rather than high risk, low reward, we really think that engagement from the private sector in Japan-South Korean relations is relatively low risk and potentially high reward. And we think that there are three things that the business community could do in order to try and push this forward. And in many ways, so for both sides, that they can just use their voices in a more active way, right? Be that voice that says, we would like to engage with the other. We would like to cooperate. We would like businesses. Sure, we disagree about Dr. Takeshima. That's not the important thing right now. We would like to engage. On the other side, we think that there are sort of different roles potentially for the Korean business community and Japanese business community. So the Korean business community does need to emphasize benefits of cooperation. They need to do this publicly. I am sure that they do this privately, and we do see a lot of pragmatism, and I'm sure they do, but they need to do it publicly. And Jiwon did a lot of searching to find public statements, and had a frustrating research experience, as she did not find a lot, or anything really. Yeah. The Japanese business community perhaps has a more difficult task ahead of them. So they do need to take wartime grievances seriously, rather than, as recent statements they've taken them very dismissively. And while they're continuing and expanding these sort of public diplomacy, person-to-person exchanges, that sort of thing, they also potentially could follow the path of apology or reconciliation that they've used with American prisoners of war. That's a possibility. That it takes time, it takes listening, right? Person-to-person exchange again. But this is the concern is that will roll over into massive backlash, and that's not what we've seen. Right? So that is not as high a risk of a behavior as they may believe it is, and as the statements seem to indicate they believe. In the medium to long term, Japanese companies have a lot to gain from this, the greater stability, deeper opportunities, perhaps some of these agreements that have never come to be. And we think that they have little to lose. Right? Another thing to sort of take away at the end is that economic relations alone, we often think that those will help, but they are insufficient. There has to be leadership. There has to be a voice that stands up and says, look, we want more and we want to do more of this. And in Japan-South Korea relations, we really think that the private sector should be prominent in taking that position. I look forward to your questions and comments. You don't need to turn it off. It's just going to turn off all episode.
Thank you for that great presentation. Sorry about the technical difficulties. But I just wanted I had a few questions, and before I get to a bit of a larger issue, I just wanted to ask a little bit more about your path forward. You talked a lot about the qualitative changes that need to happen, but I'm wondering if quantitatively, are there enough resources there right now at hand for communities to work with each other to improve the relationship, or do we need more funding
That's a really great question. So this year, they could reschedule the summit that was canceled, and they could have the summit. Perhaps they could even make this is way too bold, particularly the Japanese business community is very conservative, and Keidanren is a very conservative organization. But they have, with existing resources, they could say, let us have this annual bilateral meeting, and at that meeting, let's talk about our problems. And so they don't particularly need more resources at this time. They just need to use their resources more constructively.
Another question I had, you talked about CJK, and that's been going on for a while, and about how politics, non-economic issues have come into the fore when it comes to the relationship, but there's also economic constraints, and I not necessarily think about CJK, but I think about the other big trade agreement, TPP, for South Korea. One of the arguments I keep hearing why South Korea is a bit more hesitant to join is because of the concern about the bilateral economic relationship with Japan, namely the size of the large bilateral trade deficit that they have with Japan. So in addition to these historical issues, do these economic constraints or these economic issues pose a constraint necessarily to further the role of the economic communities in both countries to work together to improve relations?
So, in general, the barriers to coming, either Korea joining CPTPP or whatever it's called, TPP2, or moving forward on some sort of CJK thing, are largely economic rather than these political problems, right? That's the bit, like, why don't we see it yet? Well, it's because there are real economic competition problems, okay? and there are real concessions that all sides are going to have to make. But where the politics or the sort of the territorial issues or the historical memory issues or the territorial issues, right, these sorts of things, where those have come into play is just shutting down the harder negotiations. So one of the things in some of my fieldwork in Japan and China that I kept coming across is that diplomats would tell me, well, we were in the room talking about it, and then the Japanese side would say, or excuse me, the Chinese side would say, well, we can't talk to you because of such and such, political controversy, and they would stand up and leave the room, and be like, okay, and then they'd go out in the hallway and say, sorry, that's where we are right now. That's the official line. We can't move forward with these other negotiations, and then that would just stop it. So they probably could, right, move forward with economic issues if given that space. But that's where that barrier is. So it's not that I don't think that the political issues are the real barrier. They're just the real barrier for effective engagement and discussion. I also think that, so thinking about like South Korea joining TPP or the possibility of a Japan-South Korea agreement, I think is a tougher sell than a CJK agreement. But Korean dependence on Japan is declining. And in the 90s, there was a much deeper concern. I would have shared that concern that if South Korea were to have an agreement with Japan, or even all three countries, that would really lead to a swamping out of some of the, particularly like electronics and maybe component manufacturing sectors in Korea, which is extremely concerning. But things have changed since then, and Korea is much more competitive vis-a-vis Japan. The balance of development is not nearly as lopsided as it was, and I don't recall the exact numbers, like thinking of these various interdependence measures, but the trend line for Korean dependence on Japan, they're all going like this. And the dependence on China is going like this. And I think that reluctance needs to be rethought out for those reasons, because the situation just has really transformed over the last couple of decades.
I agree with what Dr. Vekasi said about the Korea-Japan historical issues, and that's preventing people from moving forward to in economic negotiations. Because as a Korean perspective, because our fundamental issue is resolving the comfort women issue, the forced labor issues, and we want to see Japan like representing and recognizing their wrong deeds, like Germany did. Like every time the Holocaust issue is brought up, Germany apologized every time. But we want to see the same behavior from Japan, and in our perspective, that's the fundamental issue we need to solve. So we talk about any other like economic issues. So that's what's I think was preventing people from moving forward. And yeah, and Korea and Japan interdependency in trade is because Korea is developing more technologically and is becoming more like competitor with Japan over time, rather than just beneficiary from Japan. So that's the change in the future.
One last question I have before turning it over to the audience is we've talked a lot about business role for the business community and their relationship with the two governments. But a really important actor in all of this are the other non-state actors, the private NGOs that have dealt with some of the historical issues, especially in South Korea. So what role, if any, should the business community play engaging with them? Because they're a very important veto player in how all of these things play out.
That's a really interesting question that I haven't given a lot of thought to prior. One of the things that we've seen looking comparatively in other maybe successful cases of reconciliation is that groups like private or NGO groups that have worked really deeply on these issues and have very meaningful relationships with victims can help facilitate meaningful connection between the legacies of the aggressors or the actual aggressors themselves in some cases and the victims or the victims' ancestors, descendants. So that's a possibility. Victims don't have to accept an aggressor's apology, right? It's their choice to accept or not accept, and to have a group that knows people well and knows things well to be able to work a path that everybody is comfortable with is possible. Mm-hmm. There's working through. I mean, there's been a lot of advocacy through the Japanese court system by South Korean groups that hasn't gone well moving towards reconciliation, and something more private I think would work better. It's worked very well in some other models, including, and as I brought up in my comments, in the American context. Many decades later, right after the victims were very elderly, which is the same in this case. So I think that there could be a role there if the companies were willing to do that.
Yeah. How businesses should engage with private NGOs? I know a few Korean companies that support the victims of comfort women, and so they actually gather some drawings and some poetries or some arts things from the victims of or still living victims of comfort women, and they put that design into their products. So they support the comfort women victims, and then let consumers know that these are the artworks from these grandmothers now, and the revenue, the profit the company makes goes to the supporting the comfort women, the foundation or those institutions in Korea. So I think it's getting recognition by young Korean people now. It's starting to. So if more companies or small businesses can join or work towards supporting those comfort women or other forced labor victims, they can work in Korea.
Thank you both for those great responses. So I'll turn things over now to the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand. There'll be a roaming mic. Before you get the mic, please remember to state the name of your institution, who you are, where you're from, before asking your question. We'll start with, actually, we'll go with Ambassador Zumwalt, and then Mark will come to you.
First of all, thank you very much for this really good study. I learned a lot from you today, and I'm glad you're doing this research. I actually had, they're not questions, but maybe 2 comments that I'd appreciate your reaction to. If I heard you correctly, you said you could not find examples of either Japanese or Korean companies who had spoken up assertively about improving relations. And then you have a lot of research saying that companies that keep a low profile don't face risks of consumer backlash. But I'm not quite sure how then to draw the conclusion that therefore you can take a high profile and not have consumer backlash. So I'm sure you've thought about that, but I'd appreciate a little more, draw out your thinking on how you make that conclusion. And then the second point I wanted to make, I thought you have a really good example, a really good idea of Japanese and Korean businesses seeking areas of common interest and working together and then advocating with both of their governments. I think that's a great idea. I'm not sure China is the best choice because Chinese business is not private sector. They're private companies that are influenced by the government, and there's government companies. And I would wonder if maybe the rest of Asia is a better field for Japan-Korea cooperation. And to me, a good example of that would be the decision Korea would have to make whether they want to seek membership in TPP, and then Japan's decision whether they would welcome Korea. And if both industries were to talk to their governments and say, we see a huge interest for ourselves and the other side coming in, that might have an influence, because right now I'm not confident that Korean government either would want to join TPP or the Japanese would. They're not going to oppose it, but they could make life pretty difficult. So that seems like a really good potential area for industry collaboration, but maybe if you could talk a little more about the non-China areas where the 2 sides could work together.
Great, thank you for those comment questions. Indeed, we've spent a lot of time thinking about this. So and what I have found, a lot of this pulls from other research that I've done, particularly research that looks at how Japanese companies manage risks in China. And the Japanese companies follow essentially the same strategy. They keep a very low profile. They were very explicit about this in interviews I did with them in order to try and avoid any sort of political backlash. And if there was anything that would, in the Chinese context, that brought Japanese companies into more high profile, sometimes that was just the structural nature of the company. Uniqlo sells clothes and they have a storefront on the street and then it got smashed, right? Family Mart is right? They have all of these, they have like 20,000 little shops throughout China, and they're just very visible, and so they would get smashed, et cetera. Or they had companies that had the character Sun for Japan, right? That sort of thing. So they couldn't do anything about that. But then also companies that had made statements about any sort of historical revisionism or whatever, or textbook issues, also found themselves getting targeted. So they were really explicit. We need to keep a very low profile. But in the Chinese case, it didn't matter. That even as they kept this low profile, they still faced the backlash. They were still Toyota. And there was nothing one could do about that. It was still a high-profile Japanese company. And in the Korean case, we have those same structural factors, not with Toyota per se. So there's different things going on with the Korean and Japanese auto trade that doesn't make it a very interesting case. But we do see that these companies that are explicitly targeted by activists, by not through doing anything particularly related to history or territorial issues or anything, don't face that backlash. And so we think that a more of a high profile probably will not make a difference. So do we have evidence of that? We don't have direct evidence because it hasn't happened yet, right? So it's possible that companies could take our advice and we would have to give very, very deep apologies to them if we're wrong. But we're pretty confident because all of this, when we line up what happened in China and what happened in Korea, we see one outcome in China and a different outcome in Korea. So we think it's relatively low risk for that comparative reason. And this last incident, because it specifically involved companies and history issues. Like, okay, well, this is the time we should expect to see it. Right? We should expect to see there be more of a backlash against business. And again, we haven't seen it. Even as companies in the private sector was brought more into the public eye in Korea. And we do have this statement from those 4 business groups saying, we oppose this political decision. If that statement had been made in China, it would have been a wildfire against Japanese companies. That's not what we see in this case. You have anything you want to add to that? No? As to the second, that right, so it's interesting to think, right, so there's been these long, almost 2 decades now of attempts at the CJK engagement, and there are, especially now that the THAAD issue, with the THAAD issues, now it's just so sticky in every direction in that trilateral. So I agree that there's potential, that maybe thinking about other countries could work better, and incorporation, like thinking maybe starting the long discussions about joining TPP could be one place to start. The even smaller, lower level engagement in Southeast Asia at the company level, I think is facilitated by these peak organizations, is probably even easier. And once there's deeper interdependence, like more joint ventures by Japanese, South Korean companies in third countries that way, and that being integrated into the supply chain, that will develop more mutual interests. So I think that's the step-by-step way to get at more institutionalized cooperation.
Mark? No, for the live stream.
Yeah. Thank you. I was curious if you had a definition of what the crisis is. You mentioned some incidents, such as the radar incident, but are those things causes of the crisis or the result of the crisis? And then is the crisis over, or might it get worse? I can see why companies might be reluctant to take too high a profile if they don't know what's going to happen next.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I think about how political crisis affects economic relations, I see crisis as these points where there are underlying structural issues between Japan and South Korea. Some of those are, these economic competition issues that we've mentioned. Some of them are the use of what's happened in the past in the politics of both countries, that there's extensive research out there showing that all Korean political parties use these issues, and they do, and it helps them poll better, and it helps them win elections. Right? Those are issues in Korean democracy that lead to continuing problems with Japan. That's right. So that's essentially a constant, not a crisis. And then when we have a crisis, it's when something triggers all of these structural issues to get through, to come to the forefront at the same time. So in this case, we have the reinvigoration of the comfort women controversy. We have the forced labor issue, and then we also have this radar incident, right? And so all 3 of those make all of those other consistent structural issues come to the forefront and shut everything else down. We looked at this in our research, actually somewhat quantitatively, and we can look at bad events that happen, and you can see that all of a sudden they'll all happen at once, and you see these spikes. That's a crisis. So when does a crisis end? Well, it's usually in the case of these sort of non-militarized crises, they end when the leadership decides it's going to end, right? So it's really too bad that they're not going to meet at G20, because that could have been a signal, right? The crisis is going to end. That's how they've often ended between Japan and China with leadership summits. And indeed, that uncertainty of when will we see it, I agree, completely contributes to the sort of uncertainty and higher risk perception of the private sector. Now, if the private sector were to say, we would like to, and we will do the following in order to make it happen, perhaps some of that uncertainty could be eased. But no one's saying that. They're waiting for the signal on top, and that's one of the problems, right? There's no leadership in that way. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nick Sechaney with CSIS. Thanks very much for the paper and the presentation. I associate myself with a comment earlier by Ambassador Zumwalt that China could be a complicated issue for Japan-ROK business dialogue. But I was also really intrigued by your point that both Japan and South Korea have experienced economic coercion from China. And that's a strategic theme that could really get at shared challenges that currently, and dialogues that aren't taking place currently because of political tensions between the two countries. And I also had a question about the public opinion polling data, and that is if you came across data that separates views on Japan-ROK relations based on demographics. I think Japan's Cabinet Office came out with a poll at the end of last year, which resonates with what you've been showing, that overall the trend line is not very positive. But the group that was most optimistic about Japan-ROK relations was 18 to 25. So that just reinforces your point about the role of the business communities in both countries emphasizing exchanges and nurturing the next generation. Thanks.
Yeah, we have looked at public opinion data, and we've looked at a variety of surveys ranging from about 2008 through more recent years. And we found similar things. So in Korea, in particular, there's a younger cohort that is much more positive, an older cohort which is much less positive. People in their 40s and 50s was very negative, actually. Yeah, so that was even more negative feeling towards Japan than the colonial era generation or their immediate descendants. But the younger cohorts were much more optimistic, and that's the same in Japan. Feeling towards Korea, and the Korean wave has done wonders. And the World Cup in 2003, two, yeah, in 2002, I think also was a nice turning point in younger generations' feelings about South Korea and Japan. Yeah, and Winter Sonata, of course. Actually, I'm kind of kidding, but also not kidding. I think that Winter Sonata did wonders, and there are all these Japanese tour groups that went to South Korea so they could, visit the places that were in the drama, and they, saw how wonderful South Korea was, or Korea was, and yeah, so very positive.
Thank you, Wee Young from the Korean Embassy, and thank you for your very insightful work. And for what it's worth, if people around 18 to 25 would be pessimistic, that would be a big problem. So I guess they could be optimistic for everything. My question is a bit of similar to our colleague from CSIS. So about the sharing the strategic challenge, from the Chinese possible economic coercion. If I was not mistaken, you were alluding that sort of sharing affected the consumers' behavior in both countries, taking care of the political incidents or dragging those political crises into the economic exchanges or people's exchange. I think it struck me quite reasonable assumption on inference. But any chance, do you have any data or backing up such assumption on inference, or any sort of a possible argument based on evidence?
So evidence evidence that Korea and Japan are facing economic coercion in China following political tensions?
No, such sharing of the same challenge, does it really affect the behavior, or is it just a correlation, or is there any possible ground for causation?
That's a great question. I don't have any, and this is something that would have to, so I think that that's a really intriguing idea that this shared experience of economic coercion, the shared strategic challenge, as you put it, could lead to more, I don't know, shared worldview, perhaps, and desire to cooperate. In order to, the evidence that I think would fit that well would be to go and talk with these peak organizations and see what they say. What, like, in their conversations, does it come up? How do they talk about it? I haven't had an opportunity to do that field work yet, but it would be extremely interesting to see if that's something that they actively talk about in public documents. Right, you're not going to see that so much.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. I'm trying to get into the line of thinking that you have here, and what occurs to me is the following possible problem. I recently heard, for example, Admiral Blair of Sasakawa, USA, saying that he was very concerned because he was hearing from his friends in South Korea that the South Koreans are thinking that the Japanese are hyping the China threat in order to have an excuse to push ahead their rearmament or remilitarization, or however you want to view it, as maybe the Koreans and the Chinese do. And of course, that's one of these sensitive issues from a historical standpoint. So what occurred to me in terms of your suggestion is the fact is, yes, this buildup of military capacity in Japan involves Japanese business. I mean, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. I mean, this is the whole, I mean, it's not coming from nowhere. It's with the total support of the large industrialists. It has to be. I mean, they're the only ones who could do it. So produce it. So therefore, it would seem to me that there would be a suspicion on the part of, again, the Koreans and the Chaebol families and so forth and so on. Who am I dealing with here? These are the people who are the Krupps of Japan, who are remilitarizing Japan, which is exactly what we don't want. And that might be a factor that mitigated against your suggestion.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. There's certainly, I think, real concerns about Japan using the China threat as a move towards changing their security posture. And right, there's great research, particularly like Sheila Smith's work, right, that talking about that, et cetera, which I find very compelling. Thinking about Japan's sort of military-industrial complex, these companies. So I think there's a few things to think about. There's one, that the companies are private, and that they are part of the. If there was to be a great rearmament, the companies probably, no doubt, would be involved. There would also be, of course, arms sales from the United States to Japan, but the importance of within there are personal ties. I have done some field work on this. Personal ties between large Korean and Japanese companies, and those personal ties would be really important in establishing a more trusting relationship. In the last decade or so, it's started to decrease a little bit with the turnover of people. There are many older Koreans, so of course the colonial era people, but then also that their descendants, the next generation down, who speak excellent Japanese. So that's been important in establishing these close personal ties. And moving forward, that needs to be really nurtured in order to not have this go into a distrustful security spiral. So not just person-to-person ties at sort of the young high school age, impressionable level, but also within the companies, within the trading companies in Japan, right, Mitsubishi and Itochu and whatnot, and then and then the Chaebol in Korea.
At the end. So like we showed at the end of the presentation, we said both Japanese and Korean companies should work in a different ways that they have been working. So Japanese companies need to recognize their forced labors, and then that's going to be the base of cooperation. So at that point, we are saying, I guess we are saying that we have to reconcile most of the historical issues and reduce the distrust between the two countries, and then move forward to cooperation, I think should happen at the same time. Like so.
Thank you. George Hutchinson, Managing Editor of the International Journal for Korean Studies. KEI always puts on these great events, great discussion, very interesting topic. My question is a little more geostrategic. It's a little higher level, but and certainly not intended to put you on the spot. But as we all know, the U.S. gets deeply frustrated with its perceived, its being the United States, its perceived inability of establishing the trilateral component. And it would seem that Japan could really make it easy on all of us if they would come out with some sort of a bold conciliatory gesture. So diplomatically or informationally, is there something that the U.S. could do, rather than leaving THAAD off the table, of course, but is there something that the U.S. could do to try and nudge Japan along to try and come to terms with its past?
No. So that's something I've thought about a lot, and that's essentially my answer. But so in general, right, the United States has taken more of a hands-off approach in that particular realm. That it's, if they were China, they'd say, well, we don't interfere in the domestic politics of other countries. But so one of the really difficult things about this is, what would a bold conciliatory gesture look like? And some Japanese feel that those gestures have been made already. Some vehemently disagree. There's a lot of contestation about this within Japanese civil society. And the difficulty, if like, which would it come from the top? Would it come from companies? Would it come from the courts, right? Would it be some sort of compensation? There would be, and it's up to the victims to decide what they want with that, and to decide whether to accept it. So I mean, there's what we call apology fatigue, right, in Japan, and it's unclear, right, whether that bold gesture that could be coordinated or pushed or et cetera, I mean, by the United States would even be accepted. If it was clear that the United States had taken an active role in encouraging it, then it wouldn't be a sincere apology, right? And that's been one of the sticking points. It's something that has to emerge from the aggressors, right? And then it has to be accepted by the victims in order for it to actually work for reconciliation. So I don't think that the United States has a very constructive role that they could play there.
Just wait for that.
I just wanted to add a comment. I mean, reconciliation is really hard. I was in U.S. Embassy Tokyo as we were building toward President Obama's visit to Hiroshima, which is a similar, maybe not quite as large, but from a Japanese perspective, the U.S. decision to drop the atomic bomb was an inhumane act. From our perspective, it foreshortened the war and saved lives. So we had this fundamental disagreement about this historical step. So how do we overcome this? It wasn't a single bold gesture. It may have looked like that when President Obama went to Hiroshima. It took about 6 years of concerted work on both sides, because no one wants to make this big gesture if it's going to be rejected. And so, for example, we went down to Hiroshima. The mayor was a left-wing anti-nuclear activist. But luckily for us, he'd lived in the United States. He understood U.S. politics. He didn't agree with it, but he understood where we were coming from. And we made it very clear, a visit to Hiroshima will be out of respect to the victims, but it's not going to be changing our historical view of what happened. The first step was having a G7 speakers meeting. So the Japanese Speaker of the House invited Nancy Pelosi from San Francisco to come to Hiroshima for a multilateral event. She did a lot of work in her constituency to build support among veterans groups. It's time, US and Japan are allies, it's time to get over this. That visit went pretty well. So then we thought, okay, now let's have the ambassador go down at the anniversary of the event. But again, we went to Hiroshima, we talked to people. The mayor assured us, I'm not going to embarrass your ambassador. I want the president to come. And if your ambassador is embarrassed, he's not coming. So there was a lot of work on both sides. We arranged meetings with A-bomb victims. The mayor issued a statement about how sincere the ambassador was. The ambassador wrote a nice statement in the A-bomb museum. We had no photos because we didn't want the ambassador with these horrible backdrop pictures in the American news. We talked to veterans groups in the United States who supported this visit, said it's about time, let's go forward. And then years later, President Obama went there. So I think hoping for a single dramatic, bold gesture is an exercise in futility. It's going to take both sides working together really hard. And I do think a third party has to proceed with great caution because this is a Japan-Korea problem. And my own view, based on this experience, is it's going to take the two sides who each want to reconcile working together in order to get there. So I'm just wanting to offer you some of my experiences. And this was controversial within the US government. There was a lot of opposition to each of these steps. So it wasn't easy, for us either. So anyway, I just want to offer this as an observation, but I think this idea of a single bold gesture is never going to lead to reconciliation.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I want to point out one thing that you said in these comments is like there were things like veterans groups, NGOs, right? All these different stakeholders involved in the process. And any of those groups can very loudly say no if the process is seen to be coercive or not true reconciliation or real reconciliation at any of those steps. I agree that extreme caution and is warranted. Yeah.
Shahirka Goethe with the Wilson Center. First of all, Kristin, Jiwon, thank you very much for this very rich analytical piece. And this is a topic that is very sensitive. It's also very important as well. So thank you again. One of two things, one comment and a question. I am concerned about the finding that you don't really see a economic backlash against some of this taking action against on trade relations between the two sides, that we want to move forward perhaps by the general consensus is that because this history issue is so difficult to overcome, that perhaps it is easier to decouple the economic issue from the political one. But increasingly, we are seeing that that is very difficult. And with the entrenchment on both sides, as Ambassador Zumwalt said, there is no easy one single fix to this. And yet it is increasingly difficult to decouple. And your findings actually make it more difficult to have that decoupling as well. So it's actually complicated, the situation, but I appreciate the research that you've done. My question is really about some of the common issues, some common economic issues that the two countries face. Demographic issues is one of them. The other one is about diversity, and especially on the gender front. Now, both Japan and Korea do very poorly when it comes to female empowerment. And when we talk about sexual slavery, that is very much about a gender issue, and it is an issue that continues today, and it is a challenge that both countries face. You, Kristin, you've been quite positive about Keidanren and the Japanese corporate leadership, but at the same time, it is a very male-dominated and very conservative one, which probably is not the best group to advocate for gender diversity or diversity in general. Are there opportunities for the two countries to move forward on this, using the private sector to talk about, as a, they can bring the two issues of historical reconciliation and sensitivity, empathy, together with corporate interest and increasing competitiveness in the 21st century?
Yeah, that's a great question. The Keidanren in particular is, as you said it, right, a very conservative organization, and it's very male, yes. I guess is very, very, very male. And to, in the course of my research, I conducted over 150 interviews with Japanese private sector actors, and I think I spoke with 3 women the whole time. I mean, it's a very male-dominated group of people. And to be perfectly honest, I feel that in terms of reconciliation, I'm more optimistic about them moving forward on the forced labor issue, in particular because they've been able to do that with male American prisoners of war with some success, than working on the sexual slavery issue, in part for those reasons. But that's where the private sector has more culpability as well, right? That's that they need to come cleaner about that. And there's been discussions about this for example, within the Japanese, like these business magazines that come out. And starting in the 90s, they started to periodically have these discussions of, does the Japanese private sector have work responsibility? And there are complicated answers to that within those publications. But they have been discussing it, and is a feeling that, yes, maybe we do have responsibility, and we need to approach that. So they've been talking about it. I need to talk about it more and talk about it publicly more, not just these sort of thought pieces within the magazines, Toyo Keizai and that sort of thing. If it could be a more gender diverse organization and community, I mean, there's certainly, we could see womanomics take off, but that's going to be that's another slow, difficult process for both countries, I think.
Hi, so I'm currently a student at SAIS focusing on Korea and also doing a dual degree with Tsinghua University. So in terms of talking about the difference in how China and Korea respond to kind of use their economic power in a political situation, I was wondering if, when considering the political risk that Japanese companies would encounter by being more vocal on political issues in Korea, whether the difference in activist culture in Korea versus in China was considered, because in Korea, things, especially with large movements, tends to be more bottom up, while with China, it's definitely more government directed and kind of upwards down. So I was wondering if that was considered and whether that would open Japanese companies up to political risk more.
Yeah, so we certainly have spent a lot of time thinking about that. And one of the things that we found is that, so it's not that there isn't a response in Korea to these provocations. It just doesn't. The targeting tends to be also more state oriented, and so you see a backlash against Japanese public things like at the embassy, for example. You'll see protests, or you'll see these more official statements or activism through the Japanese court system, that sort of thing, or the Korean court system in the case of this most recent time. And so we think that we thought a lot about this democracy versus authoritarianism difference, and that in the Korean context you see activism happening through official channels, right? So it is grassroots activism, but the targets are more official channels, right? Versus the authoritarian Chinese context, where you see some activism oriented at official channels like embassy protests and demands for official apologies and that sort of thing, but you also see these more informal protests and targeting of economic actors. To some extent, it is state controlled and promoted and happens because of the role of the Chinese state and party, but not completely. There also is a lot of grassroots Chinese activism that targets Japanese business interests. And we know that it's private activism through research done on the ground, right, where people people have gone and interviewed activists, and they see a mix of state-led activism and private-led activism. We also know it through careful analysis of the means of mobilization of social media. And we also know it because there are lots of protests that the Chinese government publicly tries to shut down, and they happen anyway. And they will end, right? They won't go on indefinitely against the will of the state, but they do happen. So we see that there's grassroots activism happening in both places. And we attribute a lot of these in the paper that's forthcoming. We think about sort of the role of the relationship with globalization with societies in both countries, and see this difference in trade-affected areas and how the different populations sort of view Japan and view Japanese private interests. And we find that in particular, more trade-affected regions in China tended to be more anti-Japanese and tended more towards these sorts of activities. But in Korea, we found the opposite effect. So we think that's a little bit more what's going on, but I also think it's an area ripe for more research, if that's something you want to pursue.
Sure. Okay. So we've actually just run out of time, and I hope I speak for everyone in the room and say that was a fantastic presentation, and looking forward to more research coming out of this great duo. And I hope you all will join me in thanking our two presenters, Kristin and Jiwon, for their time.